Hi everyone, welcome to another video. Today I want to share one card design, but I have two different ways that I'm going to go about doing it. Before I do that, I want to remind you to follow me across social media if you haven't already. Those links are going to be down in the description box below. Also, while you're down there, you can subscribe to my channel if you haven't already. And if you enjoy this video, the thumbs up button always helps. I am using this stamp set from Crackerbox Suzy Stamps. It has both the solid and the outline egg, so I'll use those to create two different backgrounds. For my first, I'm using my Misty, and I've got a piece of cardstock in my Misty now that measures 4 inches by 5 1/4. I'm also using my creative corners down there in the bottom right hand corner. That helps to pop my cardstock away from the sides and the bottom, so I get it's easier to create backgrounds, and I'll show you how in a moment. I'm lining up my little solid stamp. That's what I'm using on my first background with my Misty. And then I'm going to ink up my stamp. I'm using Catherine Pooler ink pads today. This is called Pixie Dust. And I just inked up my stamp. Before I stamp it down, I want to take a dry cloth and just pat the top of the stamp. Not rub it or anything, just pat it gently and remove some of that ink. That's going to create a little bit of a gradient and almost like it has natural shading on your stamped image. So I'll stamp that down once. Now I want better coverage, so I'm going to go ahead and again ink it up, and then once again use my towel just to dot off the very top of that egg, and I'll stamp it down a second time. You could by all means leave it one time stamping, and it's a gorgeous result. I just happen to like the two stamp look better. Now these stamp a little splotchy at first, but they do even out as they sink into the paper. So keep that in mind as you're stamping as well. I'm going to go ahead and move on to my next stamp. I've moved my little egg there up to the top now. Whenever you're stamping backgrounds, remember to always go ahead and have some of your images hanging off the edges. That's just going to create a more true pattern paper look, so it's not going to be so symmetrical. It looks like you've actually taken a piece of pattern paper and cut it up on your own. I'm doing the same exact technique for my green ink. So I've inked it up once, patted off the stamp and stamped it down, and then did the same thing for another round of stamping. I'm moving on to my pink ink, again inking up my stamp once I've moved it to the next place. Then I'll go ahead and pat the very top of it with my dry cloth, and then I'll go ahead and stamp it down once more. There is a closer look at how that looks once it's dry and all leveled out. You can see the natural shading you get just from doing this technique. Now whenever I ink and stamp these, each one I'm doing the same exact thing. I'm blotting off the very top of the stamp. If you wanted to, you could go in and do this like an actual coloring. Like if you think about when the light hits an object, you have a shadow going one way. I'm not doing that with this. I'm keeping the top of the egg lighter, the bottom of the egg darker, but you could by all means have a light source in this and do different parts of your egg shaded. Just keep that in mind whenever you're stamping. I'm not great with light sources or coloring, so this is what works for me. As I'm stamping, I just built up that background. Now, at some point, it's probably best to turn over your image or turn over your paper and stamp from the other side. And that's what I've done here. And I'm just finishing up with this very last stamp. Another good thing to keep in mind as you're stamping out your background, be sure you don't have too many of the same color right next to each other. So you can see I've switched around ink pads a lot. I have made sure that I don't have too many pinks right next to each other, too many blues, that kind of thing. Make sure you're spacing them out for a really fun look. There is a closer look at that background all ready to go. This one is my favorite. I love the way these eggs turned out. I love this technique. It's super easy. For my next technique, I'm going to be using Midnight Ink from Catherine Pooler, and I'm going to go ahead and use the outline egg stamp from the stamp set. I'll again just create a very quick background, this time just with the black ink. I am stamping on Arteza watercolor paper, because I will be using their water brushes to go ahead and color in just a moment. Whenever I'm stamping this too, I chose my Catherine Pooler ink because it works well with my watercolor markers. I have a video about all the mediums that Catherine Pooler's Midnight Ink works with, so I'll go ahead and leave that linked in the top right hand corner. I know when I first started stamping, that was something I had a lot of questions about. What black ink pad do you use? At what time? It got so confusing, but I wanted to create some videos about different black ink pads and what mediums they worked with. So if you bought one, you can go to that video. I test it all out for you and you don't have to have any of the guesswork. Now once I had my background stamped, I set that aside just to dry for a few seconds. I should mention too, before I move on, that when I stamped on my watercolor paper, I did stamp on the smooth side. So that's going to create a nice smooth surface for me to go ahead and start coloring. I'm using my Arteza Real brush markers. I love these markers. They're so much fun to play around with and so many different techniques. I have reviewed these and I share a lot of those techniques in that review, so I'll leave that linked in the top right hand corner as well. I'm also using the Arteza water brush marker. If water brushes aren't your thing, you can always use just a regular brush and some plain water. That works too. There is a closer look at the coloring I am doing today. It's super, super easy. I'm keeping the same exact shading that I did on my first card. So I'm putting my main batch of color down at the very bottom of the egg, and then I'll just use my water to blend that color and make it lighter as I go towards the top of the egg. I'm not worrying about a light source here or anything like that. If that's more your style or you're really good at coloring, by all means go ahead and do that. But I find this is what's easiest and what works best for me. Again, as I'm stamping this background too, I'm switching up my colors quite often. Each time I'm going in with a different color. That is going to allow me to get a nice array of colors, and no two colors or no color is going to be by itself so many times. So I'm not going to have a bunch of pinks right next to each other, a bunch of yellows, and so on. At some point, you're going to get to those little bitty pieces of eggs that are hanging off the edge. You've seen that just a minute ago with my little purple there at the top. What I like to do with those is actually scribble a little bit of color just on my craft mat. If you don't have a craft mat where you can pick up color, you can use an acrylic block, you can use a palette, whatever works for you. Just a nice slick surface that the pigment is going to sit on top of. Then use your brush or your water brush, pick up that color and fill in. That way you don't get such an intense color coming straight from the marker to the paper. When you're doing whole eggs, that works really, really well, or whole images, but sometimes you don't want all that color. When you don't want it, just pick it up from a secondary surface and add a little bit of water as you go, and it blends out beautifully. You can also color like that. If you have trouble putting this down on paper and then blending out, you can come from your craft mat and blend right onto your cardstock as well. One thing I will mention with these markers, people have said they don't blend well for you. You have to be working on watercolor paper. These are a watercolor marker. You also can't let them sit for a long time. If you let it sit on your paper, it's going to soak in. It's not going to move around. I find it especially difficult with blues and purples. So just make sure you're not letting it sit a long time, and you should be able to blend those out really well. With my two backgrounds done, I needed to go ahead and create a place for my sentiment while my watercolor was drying. So for my sentiment, I wanted to create a little frame to kind of pop it away from the background. So I cut a square that was, or a rectangle that was slightly larger than my rectangle die. Then I inlaid my die right into my little rectangle that I cut, and there I had these nice little craft frames all ready to go. I did 2 of these, and I cut each rectangle the same size as my white sentiment rectangle that I'll be stamping on today. So there's just a little extra tidbit in case you don't have kind of a nesting rectangle set that's small enough to where you feel like you can get thin enough frames. Just cut your own rectangle with your paper trimmer and then inlay your die right into that, and you can get as thin of a frame as you want. For my sentiment, I am using the extra stamp from Crackerbox and Suzy stamps, and I'm stamping that down with my Misty with icing on the cake ink from Catherine Pooler. It's a nice brown ink. I do need to re-ink mine. You can see it's well loved. I love blending with this one, especially to give like a nice vintage look around my edges. It just is kind of that perfect brown tone. So I'll go ahead and stamp that down a couple of times, and there I have my sentiment all ready to go. I love using my Misty, especially when I'm doing multiple cards, because each one's going to stamp exactly the same way. I don't have to line it up a bunch of times. To glue on my frames, I like to use liquid glue. I am using the Imagine On Point glue today. It's a clear glue. It's got a nice little nozzle on it. You can get the thinnest strips of glue. It's become my favorite, to be quite honest. And also, you see in the top left-hand corner there, I've got my little cap. That pin goes directly into the nozzle of the glue, so it never gets clogged, which is huge. I love glossy accents, but I fuss and fuss and fuss every time I need to get that out and use it because I've got to unclog the nozzle. I've tried it all. I've tried burping the bottle. I've tried keeping a pin in it, but that just rusted. So this is nice. It doesn't clog on me. I love it. There's a closer look at my sentiment all framed up. And now I just needed to go ahead and put my sentiments onto the card panels. So I have each card panel. I've got my stamped one in the top left-hand corner, and I also have my watercolor. I'm putting the sentiment frames just right in the center of the panel for a nice, simple card design. Because it's so simple, I did use a little bit of fun foam on the back of that to pop it up and give it a little bit of dimension, and you've got that nice little shadow. For the finishing touch, I just need to pop my panels onto card bases. I am using A2 top folding white card bases, so 4 1/4 by 5 1/2. I make these myself. I do have a video on that as well. I'll leave that linked in the top right hand corner too, so you can see how I make my card bases. I'm going to pop that panel right into the card base. I like to open up my card base, lay it flat on my surface, and then put it down. I start in one corner and then just kind of work my way around the card panel from there. There is a closer look at the stamp panel all ready to go. And finally, I'm going to place my watercolor paper down. Watercolor paper, I like to put a little bit more adhesive on so it lays nice and flat, and that way I don't have any warping or any funky bumps in my card. There's a closer look at that, all ready to go. And one final look at both cards. I love both of them so much, and they were both fun to make. But I only had to use that one stamp set because you get both the solid and the outline. You can make two different designs. For the inside of my card, I'm going to use that solid stamp. You could go in and use the outline and color in, but I just like to go ahead and stamp little eggs. Stamping's my favorite pretty much. So I'll go ahead and stamp a little green one on one of the inside of the card in the bottom left-hand corner. And then I'll go ahead and stamp a little yellow egg on the other one in the left-hand corner at the bottom for a very simple finishing touch on the inside of my card. I love the way these turned out. I had a blast making both of them, and I hope you guys enjoyed this video. There are going to be links on the left side of your screen that you can click on. You can also subscribe to my channel over there if you haven't already. Don't forget all the information in the description box below. That is going to do it for me today. Thanks for watching, and happy crafting.